Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 2 of his On the Nature of the Gods, Cicero will have the Stoic Balbus provide a number of distinct arguments for the existence of gods. So these are a number of considerations that are supposed to lead us to the conclusion that God or the gods exist. And the first one that he devotes quite a bit of discussion to, it's not actually the first proof. There's an even weaker one, perhaps, that's provided in saying that, there's manifestations of the gods. We saw, Castor and Pollux fighting. The second one that he's going to provide has a little bit more weight to it, but it's ultimately a pretty weak argument. And I think many of us will be able to see through it as it's being set out. So it begins by saying prophecies, so praedictiones, predictions, right? And premonitions, praesensiones, when you can feel that there's something going on, sentire there, declare that future matters can actually be, and he's going to give kind of an interesting string of things here. They can be shown, ostendi, they can be warned about, monstrari, they can be portended, which is basically just a transliteration of portendi, and then they can be predicted, praedici. So praedici means to say in advance, to say what's coming. So is this an argument at this point? Well, it's going to be developed into one. They're saying that there are, in fact, prophecies and premonitions, and these do bear on future matters. And the way to make this have a little bit more weight is to talk about past cases where somebody took something seriously and then it came to pass, or they didn't take it seriously and they should have, and there were bad results. So he's going to give a lot of examples. Many of these are, at the start, stories about past seers, that is, past prophets. He says, even if we think that the stories of Mopsus, Tiresias, Amphiaraus, Calchas, and Helenus are mere baseless fictions of romance. And then there's an interesting little line here. Though their powers of divination would not have even been incorporated in the legends had they been entirely repugnant to fact. So the idea there is, well, there's got to be something to these stories. Maybe Tiresias didn't predict exactly what we hear him predicting to Oedipus in Sophocles' play, or maybe Tiresias wasn't actually changed into a woman for a while and then settled the bet between Zeus and Hera, but there's got to be something to this. Okay, so that's fairly weak. Then he talks about the recklessness of commanders who ignored the prophecies that they should have paid attention to. The recklessness of Publius Claudius in the First Punic War. Claudius in jest mocked the gods when the chickens were being released from their cage, refused to feed. He ordered them thrown into the water so as they would not eat, they might drink. But the joke cost the jester many tears and the Roman people a great disaster, for the fleet was severely defeated. So obviously the chickens were referring to the fleet. well, you got to make some leaps to get there, right? And we have some other examples as well. His colleague Junius during the same war lost his fleet after failing to comply with the auspices, cutting up birds and looking at them. In consequence of these disasters, Claudius was tried and condemned for high treason, and Junius committed suicide. So see the bad end that they came to by not paying attention to what the gods had to say. And he goes on with a number of other examples, and we don't need to belabor that. Then he talks about, and this is kind of a strange way to reinforce his argument, the current neglect by the present day leaders. He says, owing to the carelessness of our leaders, the nobility, the augural lore has been forgotten, and the reality of the auspices has fallen into contempt, only the outward show being retained, and in consequence, highly important departments of public administration, in particular the conduct of wars, are carried on with no auspices at all. No taking of omens when crossing rivers, none when lights flash from the points of the javelins, none when men are called to arms, right? And so what is he saying there? This is going to go badly. But is there any evidence for that being provided there? No. So Cicero is setting up Balbus, I think, for a takedown. Then we get reference to something that a lot of the Romans would have viewed as, pretty heavy hitter, the Sibylline prophecies or Sibylline oracles. There were these books that were a bunch of prophecies, rather vague. And by the way, you'll see later authors referring to it. Early Christians will say, oh, by the way, even your books of oracles support our point of view. So this is something that Romans would have viewed as important, but perhaps we don't quite so much. And then he talks about this interesting case of Gracchus, right? So Gracchus, Tiberius Gracchus, consul for the second time, is going to hold elections of his successors. And the first returning officer, in the very act of reporting the persons named as elected, suddenly fell dead. Gracchus proceeded with the election. Perceiving that the public had been aroused by the occurrence, he refers it to the Senate. The Senate votes that it should be referred to the customary officials. And who are these? The Roman augural people and the Etruscan soothsayers. So these are two different kinds of, we could say, diviners, people trying to figure out what the will of the god is. And first, Gracchus doesn't like what they have to say, because they say that the elections had not been in order. And so he says, who are you, Tuscan barbarians, to know the Roman constitution? And then he sent a dispatch from his province to the College of Augurs to say that while reading the sacred books, it had come to his mind there had been an irregularity when he took Scipio's Park as the site for his augural tent. And so they refer this to the Senate, and the Senate decided the consuls must resign. So Balbus is saying, look, here's a pious guy. Even he at first didn't want to go along with it, but now he recognized the gods were telling him what to do. So this is essentially just accumulating a whole bunch of different examples that are supposed to support this idea that there are indeed prophecies and premonitions coming from the gods in whatever way, through soothsaying and augury, or perhaps other things, other modes of divination. And we do well when we follow them, we do poorly when we don't. And the implication there is, because the gods actually do exist and the gods do know. Then he's going to talk about the office of the augur, and he's going to say it is of high authority, and the soothsayers are also divinely inspired, right? So he says, is not one who considers these and countless similar facts compelled to admit that the gods exist? Now we're going to get something that's more like an actual argument. So what is it? Well, if there are people who interpret the will of certain beings, then those certain beings must exist, because otherwise you couldn't interpret their will, could you? So, the argument here is assuming another premise. There are such interpreters. Those are the people that we call the augurs and the soothsayers, the diviners of different sorts. So they exist. They interpret. What they're interpreting must exist, namely the gods, because they have divine wills that these people are able to, come up with some sort of take on. And then there's, a good objection that gets brought up. Well, not all prophecies actually turn out to be true. So, maybe it's just kind of random, or maybe they're making it up. And Balbus's response is, well, not all sick people get well, but that doesn't mean there's not an art of medicine. Does that actually support the idea that there is indeed an art of divination or arts of divination, and therefore the object of it must exist just the same way that the health of the body, something we can easily see, must exist if medicine is practiced upon it? Maybe not so much. Then there's another interesting response to this objection. Well, yes, not every prophecy comes true, but in a way it does. The gods, as he's going to say, manifest signs, signa, of the things that are to come to us human beings, and then it's up to us to interpret these correctly. So if we make mistakes, irraverunt, right, to make errors, to go astray in these, whose fault is it? The fault is not with the divine nature, but with human inference, or literally conjecture, conjectura, right? That is where the problem arises. So technically speaking, all the prophecies are true. We just sometimes get them mixed up. If that is indeed the case, and that's a big if, well, then that, I suppose, could support this argument itself, a hypothetical argument. If there are people who interpret the will of certain things, namely the gods, then those certain things must exist, namely the gods. So this is basically the sum total of the arguments, plural, that are being provided from various forms of divination. Probably the weakest of the arguments that is engaged in at length in this early part of Book 2.